カット情弱チャンネルです。今年も早いものであれやこれやで1年が慌ただしく12月も終わろうとしています。今から83年前の12月は戦後の日本、今の日本を決定的なものにする重大な出来事があった月です。1941年12月8日未明、ハワイ時間では12月7日、日本が真珠湾攻撃を開始し、これが事実上の日米開戦の火蓋を切る結果となりました。多くのアメリカ国民はこれを奇襲攻撃だと非難し、敗戦国日本人の多くの人たちもそのように教えられてきました。しかし、今日、真珠湾が攻撃されることは、ルーズベルト大統領のアメリカ側は事前に知っていた、予測できていたというのは、もうかなり有力な説になっています。我那覇さんがインタビューしたアルフレッド・ジョンソン氏のお話はアメリカ側、アメリカ人の調査分析なので、より驚きとともに、その説がより確かなものと実感しました。そして、私が調べた日本側ですが、なぜかこの大事な作戦は、表の会議には一切かけられなかったこと、海軍の最高責任者である、長野治軍令部総長は、任期切れの山本五十六連合艦隊司令長官をわざわざ継続させたこと、山本長官が真珠湾計画を実行させなければ職を辞すると脅したこと、二人ともハーバード大学の留学組であること、そして戦争戦略の理に基る奇襲攻撃をなぜやったのか、派手好き、博打好きの山本さんの性格がうまく利用されたのではないかと謎が深いです。いずれにしても、この真珠湾攻撃によって、アメリカは参戦することの口実ができ、ルーズベルトの思惑通りになった。その結果、日米は限定戦争じゃなく、いきなり総力戦になった。歴史に不はないと言います。でも、相手の罠にはまらず、真珠湾攻撃をとどめていたならば、その後の原爆投下も、GHQ が乗り込んできて作った今に続いて、いろんな問題を巻き起こしている源、戦後、レジームというものもなかった。少なくともポチにはなっていない。別世界が見えていたのかもしれません。では、我那覇さんの貴重なインタビューの一部をご覧ください。
Had anticipated an attack decades prior to 1941 of an attack on Pearl Harbor. And you'll see that. We had actually planned it. We knew it could happen. We knew, Pearl Harbor was vulnerable. We had a game played it, and it was in the plans, and it was public knowledge, actually. We'll show that here in a few minutes. And then based on that, there was actually no failure. Everything went pretty much according to plan. which is the shocking part, right? We had trained for it. It was in the plans. There really wasn't a failure, because we knew that there would be a surprise attack, probably on Hawaii, and that would begin the war. And so we were prepared for it. We were planned for it. So it really wasn't a failure. It was according to plan. So that was a big surprise. And then as we kept digging, we kept going into the source documents. We kept looking at some really good research that came out lately. We kept having more surprises. And so for the Japanese, I'm not sure. Some Japanese, I believe, have these same kind of ideas about history. And the U.S. definitely does. In fact, you actually run into arguments with Americans if you kind of go against this. It's become a religion, unfortunately. World War II in America for certain groups of people is a religion. And if you debate on facts or you present new facts, they argue with you as if they're arguing against, as if you were attacking their religion. So it's very contentious. But this is kind of what most Americans believe, and it's the kind of what we call the conventional narrative. That after the First World War, America kind of retreated back into isolationism, and because of that, the military was not prepared, and that we were woefully unprepared. We were asleep between the wars, and then the rise of Japan, and then the attack on Pearl Harbor, was a surprise attack. And sometimes you'll hear variations that we knew the Japanese were going to attack, but we didn't know it was Pearl Harbor. We thought it was only going to be in the Philippines or Southeast Asia. So we had no idea that it would be in Hawaii and Pearl Harbor. And if people bring up the economic blockade or the economic sanctions that America had against Japan, they say, well, we were doing it because since 1937, Japan had, they were at war with China, and that's why we were doing it. We were defending China, or we were responding to the Japanese aggression in China, and that's why we had this economic policy. However, what we found out was pretty much the opposite. That America had continued foreign engagement and military buildup after World War I. We didn't stop. We continued to build up on the Navy side. The Army side, not so much, but that was by design. It wasn't by negligence. It was by very calculated planning, because the Navy required, if you lay down a ship, that requires a lot of investment, right? So you have to really build this thing up, and it needs to last about 20, 30 years. And it may take 5 years or 10 years for a ship to be fully ready to go, right? Seaworthy, depending on the complexity. And so the Navy needed that. The Navy was also the front line, or the first line of defense for America. It was a primary defense because of the oceans, right, between us and our adversary, Japan, and a future adversary in Europe. We relied on the Navy to defend us. So yes, the Army was not prepared, but you can mobilize an army and give them tanks and guns within a year, right? It's very easy to do that compared to trying to get an aircraft carrier in the water and training everybody on it and putting aircraft on it. So that was by design. America didn't stop. We kept going and developing the Navy and modernizing it and funding it after World War I. So we were very prepared with the Navy in World War II. Especially in the plans and the equipment, how it was designed for the Navy, the Marines, and that sort of thing. We knew Pearl Harbor was a viable target as early as the 1920s, and we'll go into that here. So it was never really a surprise attack that we were surprised. It was in our plans that we knew that if we had assets in Pearl Harbor, the Japanese would attack them. And the U.S. was not adversarial to Japan in 1937. It didn't start then. The U.S. began its adversarial relationship with Japan in 1907, 30 years before the Second Sino-Japanese War that everybody tends to point to in history books, saying, well, this is the reason for it, that America began to look at Japan as an enemy. And the facts don't support that. The facts actually show 1907, we began to kind of put the target on Japan and say, okay, this is our next adversary. And then in some groups that you'll see, it was actually 1895 among some very influential people. They began to look at Japan as a peer competitor and as an enemy. So we call it Case File 003. It was the road to war. And Ronald Spector had actually written this. It's a pretty famous book, Eagle Against the Sun. He wrote it in 1985, and he didn't even have all the information that we did. And he basically said what we found out, which was few wars in American history have been so long anticipated or so long planned for. So even with the information he had, which is about a third of what we found in 1985, he could even see that, yeah, this was a pretty planned war. We were really ready for it. The myth that America had gone back into isolationism after World War I, the First World War, is basically borne out by the budget. So look at the Navy budget. And then this coincides to World War I here. So, of course, you're going to have this big jump. But the war's over for the United States in 1918. We're demobilizing by 1919. But if you'll notice, the budget continued. This is actually an arms race. After World War I, we were already in an arms race with Japan for battleships, right? So the large kind of capital ships, which defined kind of a nation's strength in those days, was naval power. And the battleship race between the U.S. and Japan was occurring after World War I until the Washington Naval Arms Treaty restricted, large ships. However, the United States never ever retreated back down. We always maintained about 2 to 3 times the budget of our pre-war naval budget. So see, we didn't stop and go back into isolationism with regards to the military. The military was always still forward deployed. We were still in China. We were still in South America. We were still doing operations in Central and South America. And in the United Nations, the League of Nations, which was before the United Nations. So the League of Nations that was formed afterward, we did not join it. However, we were very involved in League of Nations programs, such as the anti-malarial campaign, the anti-opium campaign, the anti-white slavery trafficking, and the Americans would actually fund, not directly to the League of Nations, but they would be able to support around it and give secondary support, so that many nations that were in the League of Nations would say, well, is America going to support it? And if they do, then we'll vote for it. So America was very involved in it. We actually renegotiated the finances of Germany, defeated Germany in the 1920s. We were the lead on that, which shaped Europe and actually probably led to the rise of Hitler, or contributed to the rise of Hitler, when we restructured the German debt and required them to pay it in a certain way. So we were very much involved in a lot of diplomatic efforts. We were very much involved in overseas military campaigns, small kind of campaigns in Haiti, South America, Central America, China, and we continued to build up. And here's the other part that's interesting is in 1933, we began, continually raising the military budget for the Navy. We actually started it a little earlier, 1929 to 1931. We authorized more shipbuilding, brand new ships, and that continued. And the naval shipyards in 1933, what this chart doesn't show is that naval shipyards began to increase up to, so that by the time the war hit, we had hundreds of naval shipyards ready to go. Down from a handful, in the 1930s. So our mobilization actually arguably began in the 1930s. We began the mobilization well before 1937, which is the second Sino-Japanese War. So we knew what was going to happen when we began that trajectory. So that's kind of by the numbers, demonstrating that some of those myths that we have are false. This is the road to war. This is kind of the timeline. As I said before, in 1907, just after the Russo-Japanese War, 1905, America looked at Japan, and Teddy Roosevelt actually went to the War Department and said, "Do you have a plan to go to war with Japan?" And they said, "No, sir, we don't. But the next year, but we'll get back to you." And so, in about a year, they made War Plan Orange, which was a very, very detailed plan against Japan. It evolved into a 3-phase operation, which was to allow Japan to come into our waters or our defensive area, attack us, and then over time we would do defensive operations. Then we would begin to aggress to Japan, economically blockade Japan, and then phase 3 is reduce Japan completely, right? Either by bombardment, and later when we started getting aircraft carriers, by aviation and sea bombardment. So this was a plan that was put in place very early, and the plan was worked every year. There's some major updates, but every year they're working on the plan. And then starting in 1923, America started full-scale naval exercises, and sometimes with the Army involved, the Marines involved, with home defense units in Hawaii and the Philippines and Panama, in training on that plan for the fleet. They call them fleet problems. But this was massive full-scale exercises on that plan, and then the lessons learned would kind of get thrown back in there. So, and again, 1923, that's almost 20 years prior to, Pearl Harbor. We're looking at almost 2 decades before that, and, a decade before Japan was even in Manchuria. So this kind of lays the timeline that, yes, that we were very prepared and very focused on it. I have not found been no other plans like this for any other country, to include the Soviet Union, which is crazy. This is from the United States, the Department of the Army, Office of Chief of Military History in 1959. It's called Command Decisions, and basically they lay out that every conceivable situation involving the United States in a war with Japan, including a surprise air attack on Pearl Harbor, was carefully considered and appropriate defense measures were adopted. And it closes by saying, "Rarely have war plans been so comprehensive and detailed, so complete at every echelon, and so long in preparation." So remember, we had the plan in 1908, and we worked it all the way to 1941. So including Pearl Harbor and all sorts of other contingency plans. In 1935, we started working on seeing Germany added to it, so Germany and Japan. I believe it was 1936, 37, we said, correctly anticipated Italy would join in that. Italy didn't join in until 1940. Japan didn't join in until about 1940. So we correctly anticipated a lot of the things that were going to happen. The Army planners actually knew in 1911, they correctly anticipated Japan would have to take over Manchuria, right? They just knew when China was falling apart in 1911, or the Manchurian Empire was falling apart in 1911, the American war planners in the Army War College correctly assessed that the political and economic pressures would force Japan to be able to take Manchuria. And that's exactly what happened, but it didn't happen until 1931, 1932. But the Army forecast that and put it in their assumptions in 1911. So what were the fleet problems? These things were massive. I'm kind of jealous as a military person, because we never got enough. I felt we never got enough to train, right? You can never train enough. I had never felt when I was in the military we had enough budget, enough time, and I hated it when we would have to, what we call notionalize, or do things in a shortcut. These guys between the wars, the U.S. Navy, if on the plan they were sailing, thousands of miles between Hawaii and Tokyo on the war plan, they would find the same distance and geography in South America or the Caribbean, and they would sail the actual distance during the training. So they actually got to test the equipment under as realistic conditions as possible. So the men, the equipment, and the doctrine were trained to the breaking point every single year for almost 20 years. So by the time the war hit, it was amazingly prepared for. And these were free maneuvers. So they had a half of the Navy would pretend to be the Japanese, the other half of the Navy would pretend to be the Americans, and they would fight it out every year. And sometimes they would have month-long engagements or 2-month-long training where they just fought each other. One group pretending they're the Japanese, the other group pretending the Americans, and they were practicing against the plan. And then they would take that and they would feed it back into the training, and they would repeat it every year. So this was actually a year-long process. So the Army and Navy war colleges were completely focused on what we call the spade work. So they would do things like figure out how fast and how far the Japanese planes can fly, how fast the Japanese ships are, what were they made of, what are the guns ranges. So all throughout the year, they're working on these things. And then they would put that into the war plan for that year, or the exercise plan. Throughout the year, the individual ships, sailors, and smaller groups within the fleet, for example, like submarine group or aviation group, would do smaller drills and smaller exercises to prepare for this big one that happens every year. And then they would do the big fleet problem, and then the lessons learned from the fleet problem, which sometimes lasted 2 months or more, with everybody pretty much fighting that plan. Then those results would go back into a couple things. One is equipment and design, because if you're breaking the equipment, it doesn't, your submarines can't keep up with your aircraft carriers. We need faster submarines, right? The destroyers can't do shore bombardment and air screening and anti-submarine. So we need one destroyer that can do everything, right? Okay, let's design it, let's do it, and budgeting. So they worked that into equipment, manpower, and planning, and then it would start all over again every year. And they just kept doing it for over 20 years. So if you were a young ensign or lieutenant JG in the Navy starting out in 1920, you would work this every single year, and by the time World War II hit, you're an admiral. So you've done nothing except your entire career except training for war with Japan. So our admirals basically have been training to fight war with Japan since they were since they got in the Navy, basically. So it really was an amazing system as far as how that works. So it was kind of surprising. To kind of show was it wasn't just the Navy guys. So during these fleet exercises, there were congressmen, U.S. congressmen, sometimes the President Roosevelt was on actually observing one of these fleet exercises. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. The executive level was very involved in this, including the press. The press was there. So you had Congress, you had the press, you had your politicians watching these fleet exercises, and then the Navy guys could talk directly to them and, hey, we need budget for this, and that would feed back into it. So it wasn't like a, really, really secret thing. It was kind of out there. And so much so there's a guy, and this is the other thing that was very interesting. There was a guy called Hector Bywater. I'm not sure if the Japanese know who Tom Clancy is, but in America, if you mention Tom Clancy to the Navy or military or government, they know who he is. And he was a really good military analyst that wrote, fiction, but the fiction was about a realistic kind of projection based upon the knowledge of the military, of yourself and the adversary, a kind of a what if, right? And a realistic what if, not like a fantasy what if. So back in the 1920s, there was a guy named Hector Bywater, and he had been a British spy, but he knew the naval science, and so he was able to analyze very effectively naval capability. And he analyzed the Japanese naval capability. He analyzed American naval capability. He knew about War Plan Orange because they actually put it in the newspapers. So he knew War Plan Orange is out there. He knew fleet exercises, and what he did was very early on in the 1923-24, he wrote a book called The Great Pacific War. And so this is 1925. I think this one was published 1925. And it was a theoretical war between America and Japan. What would happen, right? So, and he was actually saying that at that time, based on the equipment that we would probably have in 10 years, so about 1930 to 31, and that's when he fictionally put this war was 1931 between America and Japan when he wrote this in 1920s. It was just bloody. It was going to be high casualties. We had just gotten done with World War I. He says the Pacific was going to be similar. It's going to be, pretty bloody, pretty brutal, and for what? So it was actually kind of an anti-war. He was actually dissuading the Americans, saying, why are you doing this? It's not going to be very beneficial. But in the book itself, he has this surprise attack from the north coming into Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese coming north of Pearl Harbor on a Sunday, attacking Pearl Harbor by air, right? So it was already there. Every admiral, captain, down to Lieutenant JG, everybody was reading this book. It was a bestseller among the military, right? So they knew and they saw that's how the war started, was the Japanese could sneak up and do a sneak attack at the U.S. at Pearl Harbor. And that was 1920s, right? So 1923, he's reading it. The other interesting part was there was a Japanese that actually read this book, and his name was, at the time, it was Captain Isoroku Yamamoto, right? When he was a naval attaché in Washington, D.C., this was the book that was very, very popular when he was there. And, he notices that all the American Navy guys that he's talking to and going to dinner with, they're reading this book. So he read the book, and he wrote a paper about this book and sent it back through the diplomatic papers, and it's in the diplomatic records in Tokyo, that he wrote about this book. So the idea about Pearl Harbor may have come to Yamamoto from this book. You see? In other words, how am I going to do it? And he writes about it. Now, they didn't have the torpedo bombings and all that, so he has a lot of technical things he still has to work out. But the basic idea about doing that sneak attack to the north and coming in may have come from this book. He definitely read it, and he definitely used the same tactics later on in December 7th, 1941. So that's a possibility. We have to look more. He did meet the author when he was in London. He met the author of this book, Hector Bywater. So Yamamoto and the author met each other in 1931, and they did talk for hours. So, it's kind of interesting about, where did the idea about the sneak attack at Pearl Harbor came from. It may have come from a British guy that was trying to actually deter a war between America and Japan.